And we are live. This is beautiful. Technology enables us to connect from everywhere and anytime. Welcome to another Terraform Community Office Hours, Terraform Thursday. It's been a while, but we're happy to be back, and I'm happy to have some old faces and new faces. This is going to be a lot of fun. Mary, you've been here before, so you'll go second. Graham, you're new. Would you like to introduce yourself? New
All right,
to
I'm
the
Graham.
office hours, sorry.
Yes, I'm Graham Davison. I'm one of the engineers on the AWS Provider team. Been working on it for just over 2 years, and this is my first time coming on here for the office hours. It's, I think, long overdue.
Thank you for taking the time. And Mary, for the folks that missed out on our previous office hours, what do you do?
I am Mary Charlie. I'm the product manager for the Terraform ecosystem focused on AWS. So primarily the AWS provider, but also AWS integrations in the Terraform Cloud and Enterprise products as well.
Beautiful. So if you've joined us for our office hours before, you know how this goes. We have an hour with these fine folks. You can ask questions. We'll show some interesting things. Of course, because this is a virtual space, but also a professional event, keep our code of conduct in mind. Be nice, considerate, and respectful. Don't do stuff that you'll regret tomorrow and that you don't want to be called out on. Makes it easier for us. At the same time, if you see something that you think is not okay, let one of us know. We've got our moderator header in the chat as well. And with that, I think let's jump right into it. So first question that I have for you. Are we going to get a provider release today? It's Thursday. I'm very excited. No, I'm kidding. This is unfair. We never hold people to this because at the end of the day, the software is done when the software is done. But you did just release the 4.x provider. And we're 4 versions in, 4 minor releases. What's the biggest change for the folks that haven't tried it out?
The biggest change, we have 2 kind of highlighted changes. There's the S3 resources refactor. The S3 is one of AWS's oldest services. I think the first one or second one. And so also in the provider, it's one of the oldest resources in there. So we were getting to a point where it was hard to maintain, and it was it had some settings on it that were not easy to keep consistent altogether, and it was just getting to be a very crufty model that we had for the resource. So we took a careful chisel to it and broke it into many different pieces. So you can set the configurations on such as logging, such as replication. I think there are like a half dozen different things in there that broke it out all into separate resources. They can be configured separately, and it prevents some dependency cycles and prevents having to kind of know ahead of time what, say, an ARN is or something like that. So a lot of times people had to handcraft an ARN based on knowing what it would be. Now you can just link up the 2 resources by the bucket name, and it works very well. Then the other change is some changes to authentication for and configuration of the provider itself, and that was kind of what my big focus for the 4.0 release. So if you're thanking me for it, great. You may also be blaming me for any changes to your workflow. So the big changes we made were to add extra support to some features, like from the configuration files. We wanted to make it more in line with what the AWS toolkits have with the CLI and the software development kits, and also to reduce the number of bugs that we potentially introduce into the code by handcrafting our own code. And so we extended some support, but then to get that default behavior, we had to change the precedence order of how some of the parameters were evaluated. So I do have a few slides I can go through now, or we can if we wanted to do that a little bit later.
I definitely want to get into that. But you brought up an interesting point with the change to the S3 resource. I quickly looked it up. I remember this was on the certification exam at one point. What's the oldest resource? And I wasn't sure if it was SQS or S3. I'm going to leave that as an exercise for the reader. But if you're stuck, or if you were using on the 3x provider and then you didn't version pin, you might have had not the greatest experience, mainly on account of the resource changing and becoming more future-proof. Now, we all know software continuously develops and gets new features, and old features get taken away. Maybe a service gets retired. I don't think AWS actually does that. But in case that happens,
there's one.
there is one, right? It's it might be coming up eventually. Yes.
I think there's one already, and there are a few that are coming down the pipe, which we may have to deal with.
So if you don't want your Terraform configuration to break, one good thing to do, no matter the provider, is to always version pin. Pin your provider to the version that you're currently testing with. Maybe allow the patch level to change, but definitely don't let the major version change. 3x came out, top of my head, summer 2020, something like that. It's been a while. So 5x is not going to come out right away. There will be a lot of time in between. So make sure you stick on 4x once you're on there, and only update to 5x when you're ready for it, not when you run Terraform in it and just get the latest version. Unless you want to have a really good experience testing all of this stuff. In that case, I highly recommend checking out whenever we release stuff in private beta, let us know, because we like people that do that kind of thing. It helps us get some more insights into the tooling. With that in mind, you mentioned you had some slides. I'd love to see them.
Okay. I have not shared screen on this before, so let's see how it goes.
You should be able to click the share button at the bottom, and then I'll be able to add it to our live stream.
Yeah, I also need to do the slides presentation. That is not working. How? Sorry, having issues here. All right, give me 1 second.
Meanwhile, Mary is keeping me honest on all the dates that we're rattling off.
Yes, absolutely. And I do want to note that we have no current plans for 5.0. We're just starting to talk about it as a team. And so we'll be doing some more advanced messaging for 5.0, because what we learned with 4.0 is that we need to be talking about changes that we're making in major releases in more places. And so as we continue our planning, you'll start to see more communication sooner about major releases in the AWS provider.
And you'll note that these changes are directly shaped by the feedback you give us. So if you use the provider or any other provider or Terraform, the product, regardless of providers, and you have thoughts on that, leave us a note on GitHub. If you find issues, report them. If you have security concerns, we have a security policy that you can follow. We're listening to that feedback, and while we can't promise you that we'll help you with your specific problem by fixing your configuration, we definitely take it on and review it and make sure it actually gets used. And with that,
I'm just going to have to drop off for a second. I need to restart Chrome before I can share my screen.
And this, dear viewer, is how you can tell this is a live show, because we did not rehearse that part beforehand.
Karim, do you want me to talk about some changes coming to the 3.x series release?
I was actually going to talk about some about that, and specifically if we're backporting things at this point.
We are. So in the next couple of weeks, we will see in the 3.x series, I believe it will be 3.75, but I might be wrong. It might be 3.76. That release will have all of the new resources that we introduced in 4.0 for S3 bucket attributes. We'll be backporting those to the 3.x series. So folks on 3.x or folks who upgraded to 4 and then rolled back can have a little bit more time to continue refactoring and updating their configuration files without the interruption of breaking changes in version 4. We'll also be making some changes to the attributes in version 4 to make those optional so that they don't throw an error at configuration, at plan or apply time. That again will kind of smooth over that experience of upgrading to 4.0 and moving over to the new resources. The other thing that I want to note is that we have walked back our recommendation to use Terraform import. Essentially, in 80% of use cases, do not quote me on the exact number, but we'll say in most use cases, if you don't have other systems outside of Terraform interacting with your S3 buckets or services surrounding S3, or you aren't running like long-running data operations on S3, you should be able to simply add the new resources to your configuration, remove the old attributes, and those will be tracked in state without making changes in your S3 bucket. For folks who have more conservative internal requirements or want the audit trail in their state, then yes, using import is the way to go. So we're working on a tool with a community member called Terraform Edit, TF Edit, that will help to generate some of the code needed to make those changes to your configuration. And so you'll see some progress on that tool as well within the next couple of weeks.
Lots and lots of good changes coming our way. Import is always a tricky one because it is so hard to bring something that's basically handcrafted into Terraform in a great way. It's a conversation that we have a lot with community members, and while I'm happy to help you figure out how to do this, my recommendation is always look at your infrastructure, look at what you plan to do. And let's be honest, we plan to do X, but usually we get about 80-90% there because something falls off. And rebuild it in Terraform. Much easier than importing it, usually also a much better experience. And on that note, we're going to re-add Graham.
Hi, I'm back, and this is yet another ongoing lesson in always do your tech pre-check before joining presentation. All right, so talking about changes to provider configuration in version 4. So we moved some of the parameters around, changed some of the values. We've really extended our support for using named profiles. Those are when you set up a profile in the credentials and config files. We've expanded support for environment variables for configuration. And as I mentioned before, we made some changes to the precedence settings. Basically, as I mentioned before, we had some special code in there that handled some of the different precedence rules, and that we want to be consistent with everything. So we CC. Sorry, there's just a question here. Not sure what that.
So the question from Luke was, what is CC? And that's the second AWS provider, AWS CC.
Oh, right.
And we'll touch on that as soon as Graham is done.
Right. Yeah, so we want to be consistent with the behavior of the CLI. So, you know, if you have your environment variables set or your name profile set, and then pass specific parameters on the command line itself, those that have the highest precedence, we wanted to make everything that kind of be consistent with that. And as anyone who develops software knows, the best code is no code because it means there are no bugs in it. So those special cases were things that we had to maintain, could potentially have bugs. So we wanted to avoid that and just use what the AWS SDK actually provided for us. So this, I'm not sure how many people actually specify config and credentials files in the provider block itself, but we now offer support for setting multiple shared credentials files instead of just one you could do before. And it does do expansion of environment variables. So like your home path and that. Didn't do that before, but we've added that. And now you can actually, typo there. Now let you specify the shared config files in there directly, and same gives you that expansion. And then it does use the default locations as well in on Linux and Mac OS. That will be in the .aws directory in your home directory, and I don't know off the top of my head what it does on Windows, something similar to that. We now also have added, you can specify a custom CA bundle if you're doing something specific with HTTPS. We also let you set a bunch of endpoint configurations directly in the provider. And these are all settable using environment variables as well. And these are also settable in the configuration file on top of that, but we've added support explicitly for those. We've also, just as a convenience feature, when you're assuming a role, you can now specify duration using 1H for 1 hour instead of having to give the seconds. It looks a bit cleaner, to have 1 hour instead of 3,600 seconds. You can also do like 1 hour, 30 minutes. So the name profiles with AWS, they support a whole bunch of features that we didn't support before, or else we hadn't tested, so they may have accidentally worked. But now we're specifically making them, testing them, and documenting them. So you can obviously set just static credentials in there. That's your access key and your secret key ID. You can now set the region from the profile. Previously, we required you to set it in the provider configuration block. You can also use it to assume roles. You can actually chain multiple roles together in the name profiles. Here again, you can set custom CA bundles, and you can specify an external credentials process. That's where you have some program that will feed credentials. You get temporary credentials, and it will feed those. And that's what I actually use, I think, basically anytime I'm authenticating when I'm testing the provider. Makes it very easy, and it will auto-renew those credentials. Also auto-renews assumed role credentials. And here is the biggest change that might affect existing setups. As I mentioned, we had special cases where the environment variables that specified the static credentials, that's the AWS underscore access key ID and secret access key, I believe the names are, they would have the highest precedence. And that required us to kind of work around all the defaults, configuration loading, and it was a special case that we had planned to get rid of for a while, and with version 4, this is when we did it. And so now it will use any of the default precedents. So that means anything specified in the provider block, it has the highest precedence, then environment variables, and then anything in your config and credentials files. And this is the biggest example we're running into with reports from people out, practitioners out in the field. So in this example here is the provider configuration block. You probably can't see my cursor where I'm pointing it, but we have the provider configuration block with a profile, and then also setting the environment variables. In versions up to 3, the provider would authenticate with those environment variables, whereas now in version 4, it uses the profile that's set in the provider configuration block. So that is, if you were to use the AWS CLI and set your environment variables, you can also on each call to the CLI, you can set I think it's -- profile. And that would then use the profile. So that bringing it in line with that. Unfortunately, we ran into a case where people would set it up this way, and it would work the way they expected. With the version 3 way, where they could just set the environment variables and it would override the profile. So that is, I think, the biggest change in the authentication stuff. Probably the best way to work around that is either go all with environment variables, so you can set the static credentials, or else set the profile with environment variables using AWS_profile, or else you could use I should have added this to the slides here, but you could set the profile to an input variable, and then when you're not using it, have it default to empty, and when you're running locally, you set the variable to a value. So those are basically the changes that we've made with authentication, and hope everything works well with version 4, and that the growing pain or the change pains have not been too bad for everyone out there.
There we go, and we're back. This is useful. To me, this is very useful, because there's a couple of things that you mentioned where it's like, oh, right. I remember running into this, like the precedence of how credentials are loaded. Ever so often, you're building something locally, and you test it out with the AWS CLI and it works. And then somehow with Terraform, you couldn't get it to work because the wrong credentials were picked. And if you happen to be testing with a lot of different accounts, that can get really, really annoying. I'm glad that we made those changes and made it a little bit better. The thing I'm really excited about is IMDS v1 and v2 support, because I don't know, it just is so much nicer. I mean, first of all, actually having the session-based IMDS support on EC2 instances, so instance metadata service, and being able to retrieve information about your instance, but also authenticate properly to the provider if you run Terraform on an EC2 instance. I think we're also supporting it in the IAM task roles for ECS and containers. It's beautiful. With that,
yeah,
we had a question.
Those are actually existing features. You could use IMDS. I think it had support for 1 and 2. And yeah, you could use the container credentials as well. I don't think we made any real changes to those. And there again, we're using what the SDK provides us. And the one note I came across was, if you're using IMDS v2 inside a container, we only found out about this because of a bug, but you need to increase the number of hops that IMDS supports, because it's going from container to the instance to IMDS. Came across that because there was something, it was not falling back to appropriately.
This is good to know. We actually test our stuff. That is always nice. On the topic of testing new things, Luke Bakar had a good question asking, what is CC? And Mary, I'm going to throw this one over to you.
Of course.
What is AWS CC?
So AWS CC stands for AWS Cloud Control. Cloud Control is technically called AWS Cloud Control API, which is a new unified API standard for all resources on the CloudFormation registry. So what this has allowed us to do is be able to generate a new Terraform provider off of the CloudFormation resource schema, the CloudFormation Cloud API, or Cloud Control API resource schema. So some of the benefits of doing this are that resources are now standardized, so you can expect similar formatting between resources of different types, similar types of required attributes, similar types of data structures. Another benefit here is that because we're generating the code, we can generally adopt new features faster via this API format. And so we're still releasing weekly with the Cloud Control provider, but say AWS releases a new service on Tuesday, when we release on Thursday, if that service is available in Cloud Control, we'll be able to offer that service immediately on Thursday instead of having to wait for someone on our team to develop that by hand or to be working prior to the release with AWS to make sure that the Terraform code gets written prior to release. So it minimizes the time to market for new features. It also gives us a little bit of flexibility and decreases our development time as maintainers. What I will say right now is that Cloud Control is in tech preview, which for us just means that we're giving it a little bit of time. So we released it in September of 2021, and we're just giving it a little bit of time to get folks ready, get folks using it, iron out some of the UX considerations in the product, and also working with AWS to kind of standardize what information is coming to us via the schema and how that information comes. And so we're working really closely with the CloudFormation team to get that ready for general availability some point this year. But we don't have any dates yet, but you will keep hearing about it from us as we get a little bit closer to GA time. I know that's sort of a high-level overview. I'm happy to answer any questions about both providers, one provider, other providers, or more generally about AWS Cloud Control API, but I think I covered all of the highlights. Oh, already a question. Do we see a time when the AWS CC provider can replace the AWS provider 100%, or will those still be valid use cases to the existing provider? This is like the question of the minute that everybody asks. I think our vision right now is like better together, or the like togetherness story. Basically, the CloudFormation team and AWS are very motivated to backward what we'll call legacy resources into the Cloud Control API. So that's everything that AWS released prior to last September. So S3, RDS, EC2, all of the old stuff they are working on a migration plan to get those on the Cloud Control API. However, we recognize that folks have been writing Terraform configuration against the AWS provider for the last 8 years. And so for the long term, at the moment, we'll continue to develop both providers in parallel. And what we suggest for folks is if there is something today that you want to configure with Terraform, and it's not available in the AWS provider, but it is available in the AWS Cloud Control provider, use the Cloud Control provider to supplement against your existing AWS configuration. As AWS CC becomes more fully featured and we look at how folks are using it and what they're using it for, I think we'll be in a place where we can give more prescriptive guidance about what you should do with both providers. Should you migrate from one to the other? Will we ever stop developing one or the other? I think that's a longer term conversation, but right now, for the way we see most folks using Terraform and most folks in their sort of adoption curve of Terraform and AWS, use CC to supplement what you're using the AWS provider for, and then continue to adopt new resources in Cloud Control as you come across them. And feel free, again, to use it to test out workflows that you might have already supported in the AWS provider and choose the provider that works best for your current situation.
I think that's a really good call out. I was just developing a module that uses both providers to test out how the experience is, and it is definitely pick whatever you need. You can mix and match as much as possible, and I think that actually makes it way more powerful. If there's a resource that is only in CC right now, grab it from there. Maybe you're experimenting with Lightsail. That would only be in CC. Maybe you need that together with Route 53 domains, which I believe was merged a week ago. Super exciting feature. Put those two together. It will feel natural. Terraform has no problem getting data and inputs from a resource from a different provider. That's the whole beauty of this tool. So definitely give it a try. Let us know. Hit us up on discuss.hashicorp.com. We have a section there. We're usually listening on Twitter as well. If you have feedback, we're here for it.
I also want to call out one other thing. If you're interested in what's coming to the AWS Cloud Control provider, so the CC provider, The CloudFormation team has their schema coverage roadmap open source on GitHub. Someone who is not me will put a link to that in the chat. And you can follow along there for the things that the teams are working on. Generally, when something ends up in the done column, it will usually show up in the provider within the next 2 to 3 weeks based on when they're releasing their features to the AWS SDK.
Being able to predict some of these things is definitely helpful, but as with any software release, be wary of delays. We cannot predict how the world changes, so sometimes things take a little while longer, but rest assured, we're working on it. With that in mind, if you're just joining us, welcome. You've missed a really awesome first half hour of the Terraform AWS Provider Community Office Hours. But if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We've already answered a couple of them, and we're happy to answer a few more. And in the meantime, I think we'll share the link for the roadmap. Here we go. So you can read up on that. It is a very exciting provider, but there's a difference between a provider that's been around for 8 years and is handcrafted versus the new territory that we're breaking here. But having a service released on Tuesday and available in Terraform on Thursday is really, really beautiful. I like that. I know people ask for a lot of resources to be added. And I'm actually curious, do we have a number? Do you know the number from the top of your head on how many resources we support with both providers? Approximately.
I believe it is close to, if not more than 1,200 resource types. So that is counting a small amount of duplicates. So let's say close to 1,000 resource types. I will also say that in the AWS provider alone, we support about 700 plus different resource types and 400 something data source types as well. So really broad resource coverage between the two providers, some overlap, but I will say that Cloud Control does tend towards AI and ML services and the more new and edge resources. So there's a lot of computer vision stuff, and the more edge and new technology as they're continuing on their migration plan to bring in some of the more staple resources like EC2 and S3 and fleshing out those service areas.
That makes a ton of sense. It's much easier to adopt an API for a new service that you're building right now than for something that's been around like DynamoDB for 10 years. Happy belated birthday, if you're using that. I was always more of a fan of SimpleDB. 20 megabytes of text is all you need of key value storage. So let's see if we have some new questions in here. Because if not, then I'm going to ask Graham, what's your favorite thing to work on for the provider?
Favorite thing to work on?
I'm sure there's a war story here for a resource that just did not want to get done.
Oh, there are several. I think Elasticache was a big one where they, I think that's one we've had for a while, and partly it was coding practices and standards for the provider itself had changed. Plus, AWS was adding new features, which is, great for the practitioners, but it makes it hard for us to keep up sometimes. And then them adding yet another feature. I think it was around the global replication groups. So it had kind of a weird way of you setting up the group, and then it kind of surfaced some things that worked fine when you were using it just in one region, and then but then it made it more complicated to work around once you had to add these regional services into the global one. So it took a lot of kind of back and forth around the fixing those bugs and enhancing the service and all that. It took me far longer than I ever thought it would. But that was definitely an interesting one. In the end, it felt good to get it done, but it was just, yeah, it was far too long. And there's still definitely some with Elasticache, some things that we want to change, but they're yeah, we'll have to get to them eventually. We have a few issues there in GitHub.
So this actually leads us pretty well onto our next question. I just want to call out the amazing work y'all have been doing. I know our TCM, Technical Community Manager, Justin, is also listening. He's been working hard on getting those issues triaged. But so we actually have a question around that. Solyong is curious about the makeup of the core maintainer team of the AWS provider. Is it all HashiCorp employees? Does AWS contribute? How does it work?
Well, I can take this one. So our official team is the official provider development team is all at HashiCorp. We have a fairly large team of engineers now. For our provider organization, it may not be large at your organization, but in terms of provider teams internally in HashiCorp are one of the larger teams, which is great. And in the last year or so, we've seen a lot more involvement from external contributors. And so Justin, who we've mentioned recently, has been helping us do a lot of work to identify folks in our community that we can bring into our maintainers channel and into our maintainers calls and work with to continue their development efforts. Along with community folks, we're also seeing an increase in development from AWS as well. So we have folks from AWS service teams who contribute to the provider to help with new launches. We have folks from the SA and professional services teams who are developing based on requirements that they're hearing from their customers. And we also just have folks at AWS who are interested in Terraform and are part of the Terraform interest group and field community, or I think it's field community is what they call them at AWS, who are coming to the Terraform provider service maintenance calls or community contributor calls and just learning about what it takes to join us to develop the Terraform AWS provider. So I would say you'll start seeing some more faces in GitHub from AWS, from HashiCorp, and also some community folks who you might see contributing more than others. If you're a regular contributor or want to become one, you can reach out to me or Justin or any of the maintainers on the team, and we're happy to kind of point you in the right direction to either get started as a contributor, or if you are already a regular contributor, get you in the right channels to start joining those conversations with the rest of the core contributors.
And this is a great call out. If you're actually interested in contributing to a provider, doesn't have to be the AWS one, just in general, check out our Learn tutorials where we describe in depth all the various steps that are required, how to set up authentication, how to think about implementing the whole CRUDL, so create, read, update, delete, also how to deal with imports with pre-existing resources. And in a couple of hours, you'll be able to write your own provider. We also sometimes run these workshops at HashiConf. So if you are able to travel to Amsterdam in June or for HashiConf Global later this year, I would definitely recommend attending one of these workshops. We have our Learn team on board helping a couple dozen people learn how to build a provider. It's a guided course and it is really, really awesome. I've taken these a couple of times. I've not built a useful provider, but it's been a lot of fun. So I'm a huge fan of being able to modify my hue lamps. So hopefully that answers Solyong's question. And then Justin shared the Learn guide, so we're good on that front as well. This is beautiful. Solyong was very happy with that answer, I guess. That's always good. This is what I like about this. It's very interactive. You get to learn and talk a lot. I learn so much when I'm here just based on the questions that everyone is asking, because it does tell a story of what you're running into and how you're thinking about using things. So if you're joining us in the chat, I'm curious, what's the thing you're working on with the AWS provider? Which resources are you most excited about? Let us know, because it does give us some insight. And on that note, I've got another one for you, Mary. We see these questions a lot on the various community Slacks and community Discords, where people ask, this pull request has been open, why has it not been merged? How do we figure out which pull request gets to be merged before a different one? How do we prioritize features?
We have a couple different ways that we do this for pull requests. So I'll talk about the official prioritization scheme first, and then I'll talk about some other things that we do to kind of work through our pull request backlog. So first and foremost, the AWS Provider is a large open source project, and so we have a couple, I'll call them scoring algorithms. They're not super fancy, but they help us to understand, activity on pull requests and GitHub issues. And so we look at upvotes, comment threads, interactions with comments, and have sort of a score, number score for most upvoted, commented, interacted with issues on pull requests. So from there, we start mapping those to our core service areas, which someone, again, who is not me, will put a link to our core service areas from our GitHub repo in the chat. And those tend to get prioritized first, as they're, the areas of most use. So just for summary, core service areas are things like EC2 and compute, perimeter protection and firewalls, databases like RDS and DynamoDB, and the container services sort of ecosystem like EKS, ECR, and ECS, and some other services as well. So looking at both upvotes, is this a core service? And then how does that also map to feedback that we're getting, not only from our open source community, but also from HashiCorp customers as well? Looking at all of those together generally is how we'll rank what goes into the roadmap each quarter, with a focus on kind of the top 25 to 50 GitHub issues each quarter. Now, if a GitHub issue already has an existing pull request, or maybe there's an issue kind of hovering right outside the top 50, but it has a pull request that's ready to go, we'll generally bump that up in prioritization, because we can review that pull request and work with a community contributor rather than having to develop the coder on our own. The other way that we look at pull requests is generally once a month, once every other month, sometimes twice a month. We do what we call community gardening days, which is where, as a team, we look at a theme of pull requests. Maybe it's all extra small pull requests. Maybe it's documentation. Maybe it's acceptance tests. And we spend that day as a team burning down the backlog of those requests. So generally speaking, we've seen a lot of success in gardening days, and then also kind of working in our official roadmap to address sort of the highest priority community issues based on community interaction. So please upvote issues that you find important to you. Please upvote pull requests that you find important to you, because that's a really good signal for us as maintainers with a lot of open issues and pull requests on the repository to know which are the right places to look.
Lots of different ways to get involved and help us figure out what you're curious about. I like that focus on let's close all the small ones that we can easily get in. If you're using the provider and you're trying to go through the documentation and you run into errors, if you find typos or anything, that's worthy of a pull request. I find this one that we should call out more often, because your docs contribution might be your very first pull request to this provider, and everyone else will benefit from that. Because if you ran into that typo, maybe something was called defaults to true when it is actually false. A lot of this stuff was built over years, and software has a certain maintenance rod. It is incredibly hard to maintain 750 plus resources. It's a lot easier when you're generating all of it with 1,200, but even so, when there's humans involved, there might be typos. So feel free to send your PRs in with that. Those usually end up being very small PRs. unless you have a lot of things to say on documentations, then you should probably reach out first. But those have a huge success of being added. And as my colleague Hedda said, first ever PR was a docs PR for Vault. It works. If you're running into it, somebody else is, send us a change. And Solion actually had an interesting one. So we asked a couple minutes ago, what's the one feature you're looking forward to the most? And for Solion, that's the ability to tag security group rules. Tagging in general is a great thing. And I actually got a question on the side. Feel free, if you're watching, to also ask the question in chat. Much easier for us to highlight it here. Is defaults tag support coming to the AWS CC provider?
Ooh. I will answer the AWS CC one first, mostly because I don't know if tagging security group rules is possible in the AWS API today, and maybe Graham knows, and Graham can answer that question.
I don't know, but I can take a quick look at that.
Yeah, Graham, if you want to just look at the background and see what the possibility. Oh, Justin threw a link to an issue. Sweet. Well, in that case, hopefully it will be coming soon. I don't have exact ETA for this particular issue, but Solion, I definitely, if you have not uploaded this already, I definitely recommend that. And now I will skirt right back to AWS CC default tags. So while AWS CC has been in tech preview, one of the things that we purposefully haven't done is add some of the quality of life features that exist in the AWS provider. So those are things like default tags, globally ignorable tags, different provider configuration options that may not exist. One of the things we're looking at for the future is, do folks want these features? And if these are features that you consider like things you cannot live without when using a Terraform provider, like please let us know, because it will be based on your feedback whether or not we bring those features over to AWS CC. If you find that the tagging mechanism in the new AWS Cloud Control API schema is much easier to use at a larger scale and it's not necessary to use default tags, then we won't port it over. But if you do find it necessary, you do think it's really important, please drop an issue on the repository and we'll start considering what the possibility of that is, how it will possibly work with the new Cloud Control API, and think about when we might start introducing those additional features, provider level and global features to AWS Cloud Control.
This is a great call. I actually remember and looked up the office hours we did a year ago where we talked about default tags. To me, it's a hugely useful feature. Sadly, I'm not the only one deciding what goes into the AWS provider. So if you want to support me and tagging best practices for everything you do with the CC provider, definitely let us know on GitHub. It helps us. And these quality of life improvements, they make so much sense, but feel so unappreciated until you miss them. And it's like, wait, how did I do this? And why did I have to specify this on every resource? It was practically I don't want to say the best thing since sliced bread, because there's definitely a lot of other great things coming to the AWS provider, but it was very helpful to make it easy, especially for module developers, to say, let's make sure all of this is tagged properly. If you're curious about the office hours we had a year ago for that, we'll share a link in the chat notes.
Yeah, default tags would have been something I really would have liked back when I was actually using Terraform day to day. Because yeah, we're trying to set up tagging standards for everything we're deploying, and yeah, would have made life a lot easier.
And tagging standards are hard to maintain anyway, right? Is this resource, does your code base actually reflect your organization? Do you have a different Terraform state for the marketing department versus the events team? How is that split out? Do you need to assign cost centers? It is incredibly hard to have a good tagging strategy. And I'm grateful that we have default tag support because it does make things easier. And while we're on that topic, There's this one thing that I came across a few weeks ago, and maybe everyone already knows, but I'm happy to tell you all that I've only just discovered it, using tags for a lot of debugging information, putting in which Git commit I used for a certain code base, if that is needed, putting in who the author of something was, if it's automated or not, or if it's Terraform managed. That alone has helped with a lot of stuff. In my spare time, always also use Terraform. And so one of the projects I'm helping with is friends are setting up courses for students. And so we do a lot of stuff that we do with Terraform, but students use the various cloud providers manually. The manual things aren't tagged. So when we tag the things that are managed through Terraform with Terraform managed equals true, it's easy for us to, at the end, know which things we should throw away and which things we should keep. Makes for a much easier cleanup. If tagging is something you're passionate about, definitely find me somewhere on the internet, because I'm happy to learn from you and talk about that in way more detail. In the meantime, let's see if we have a couple more questions. And again, if you're just joining us, this is your chance to get questions answered or share food pictures. There's many options here. Food pictures obviously might not get a technical response, but we will judge if you're not eating the right thing. People are smiling because some people know what's happening here. Let's see. No questions. This makes it easy to continue on. So, oh wow, there's actually food pictures coming in. I love this. Thank you so much for making our life harder. If you joined us today for the first time, don't be shy. It's okay to ask questions. We do these office hours a lot, and I think, actually, I know that once we release AWS CC fully, we'll definitely have another one of these and talk about more of these exciting features that are coming our way. Probably have a really cool demo with one or more of the services that are absolutely limited and only available in the CC provider, which I think I have an idea of what we can do there. And I feel like I'm going to string Mary along for this one. To the question that we just had, we schedule our office hours at random intervals, random in the sense that we do them to coincide with releases. Generally, when there's a major release, we'll have office hours for that provider a couple weeks down the road, because we want you to use a provider. We want you to have an opinion on it that's more than just, did I have to upgrade? You didn't. If you use version pinning, it was totally fine. But for us, it's important that we get that feedback. We want to see what happens. As always, software is being released by humans. If we make a mistake and we have an office hours that day, you'll notice that our Terraform Thursdays are on the same days as the AWS Provider release days. There is a small scheduling problem. If there's a breaking bug, we can't have an audience. We can have an audience, we just can't have our guests here. So in that sense, it makes sense for us to schedule these as we have availability. We host them for various providers, for all of our tools. So I would definitely say join us for a future one. And with that, Graham, any closing remarks from your side?
I guess just I hope version 4 is working well for everyone. And we definitely welcome all feedback for these changes, for any requested resources, for any enhanced services. As I mentioned, AWS is always enhancing the services, adding new resources. It's kind of drinking from a fire hose for us, but we definitely want to know what resources are important for people, and yeah, welcome all feedback.
And I would like to throw it to you, Mary, but I just realized that we had one more question come in. So in the V4 release notes, we say that we've moved to the V2 of the AWS SDK. So is it possible to auth with single sign-on now?
We haven't tested that one specifically. We don't. I'd have to see what SSO options are there. Let me backtrack on that a little bit. There's SSO stuff built into, say, the profile, like the name profiles. So we may be able to pick that up. I think it depends on how the SDK implements that. For instance, if it needs to call out to like open up a web page, I don't know how we handle that, and we just haven't tested the case basically. And one thing, it's a little more challenging with doing interactive authentication. And I may be completely missing the mark here because I just haven't really looked into how the SDK handles the SSO authentication. I know previously there have been requests, and it's complicated with how, because Terraform itself doesn't get very interactive once you kind of kick it off. But so I'd have to look into that. It definitely, the goal is to support basically everything, but there may be some limitations in how it works with the less than interactive nature of Terraform itself. And then of course you have the if you're running it so with Terraform Cloud or Terraform Enterprise, you can get into some weird situations where you're running it locally. You're running Terraform locally, or you run it from your command line, but it's actually running on the Terraform Enterprise or Terraform Cloud servers. And so it's not going to be getting the authentication there necessarily, I think, unless that actually runs there. But then, of course, if you need to pop up a web page, it's not going to pop it up locally for you.
I think what I'm hearing here is that, Drew, I'm going to find you, and then we're going to do this on a live stream sometime in the future and figure this out together. Because this is going to be an interesting one, especially if you have to do interactive redirects through a browser. Things can get tricky there. Mary, any closing words from you? Thoughts or call-outs to our community?
Yeah. One, thank you to everybody who joined us today and asked a bunch of really good questions. It's been great to be back to office hours. Two, if you see me on GitHub, where I am Mary Elizabeth with no A in Elizabeth, you can click on my little profile, and I have a Calendly link for folks from the community that might want to talk to me about what we're working on in the AWS Provider, or share about their use case, or share interesting findings that they've had, or just chat about AWS and Terraform. So feel free to use that link. My calendar is always up to date, and I'm in Central Time in the US. So anytime Central Time during regular working hours, I am available to you as a resource.
I just wanted to add one note to Drew's question there, asking about the AWS SDK for Go V2. So, obviously it's V2, so there was a V1, and AWS recently released a newer version of their Go SDK, and we basically are only using that for authentication now because it does support a lot more features of the authentication features, such as expanded support for the config files, and does things a lot more automatically for you. But so far, we're basically authenticating with the SDK V2, doing some magic, and all the resources so far are still using the V1 SDK, though we've been looking at migrating things over, and the SDK V2 has a lot of nicer features, makes it much more idiomatic Go. So yeah, we eventually want to migrate over, but that'll take a while to get everything migrated over. But yeah, so we're in a kind of dual two worlds kind of state with that, and that was kind of interesting to get those two things to work together.
It takes a village to build all these things and make them easily consumable through Terraform. So thank you for that. And with that, I think I'm going to follow Adam's example. Got to run, but thanks for this. Thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for bringing your questions. We'll have more of these office hours. Stay tuned to our YouTube channel, and also check out our Twitch channel, because I'm pretty sure Drew and I are going to somehow figure out how to make SSO work. And with that, have a great rest of your day.